Hey YouTube, how you doing? Flight Sim Guy here, and today I'm gonna try something a little bit different. Today, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a review of an aircraft that I just bought a couple days ago. This is the Lancair Legacy from RealAir Simulations. Now, let me take a moment to talk about RealAir Simulations. I only have one other of their aircraft, and that is the Beech Duke. And as you know, I'm a very big fan of that. Quite a few videos that I've posted is in the Beech Duke. And the level of simulation, or the level of realism they attempt to capture in their aircraft, as you can see here, they're top notch. They're up there with PMDG and A2A simulations. Their pricing, I think, is reasonable, considering that they're not trying to model or simulate a jumbo aircraft, but these smaller general aviation aircraft, and they do a very, very good job with regards to modeling the exterior of the aircraft and simulating what happens in the virtual cockpit. One thing I've learned about real airplanes, their attempts to recreate realism is so detailed that a lot of the times the code in their planes conflict with what Microsoft has in the default simulation engine. So to get the most out of these planes, you need to tinker with the realism setting and set them exactly to what the instructions say. Now that may in and of itself conflict with your other flying, but the good thing about FSX is once you've made changes to your configuration, you can save it as a separate file. So in theory, you can have separate files or configurations for the various aircraft that you fly. And in this case, you want to select or create a configuration file for FSX specific for this aircraft. Because if you don't, you're going to run into problems, and I'll show you what I'm talking about later. Alright, so this aircraft, let me go ahead and read a paragraph from the manual that I printed. Being mainly a kit aircraft, the Legacy is relatively inexpensive to construct, yet delivers breathtaking performance both in climb rate and top speed. It has short, highly efficient wings with extensive laminar flow. With its standard, naturally aspirated 310 horsepower engine, it can achieve well over 2,000 feet per minute climb rate and has a top speed of up to 250 knots, true airspeed in the right conditions. This makes it an unrivaled sports plane and quick cruiser, in addition to having outstanding ability in handling, whether for sedate cruising or semi-aerobatics. Now, this is the first kit plane I've bought. I didn't realize it was a kit plane, but if you look at it, it doesn't have a yoke. It has a flight stick. And you can see where most of the value in this thing is in the avionics. It has very rudimentary rudder pedals, and it only seats 2 people. Now, it also gives you an option for a 400 horsepower turbocharged engine. What that means is this bad boy can climb and it can cruise at, I think, up to 18,000 feet, which is pretty high for a plane of this sort. And turbocharged means as it gets higher in the atmosphere, the air gets thinner and thinner, but the turbocharger allows it to pump more air into each cylinder, making it think it's at a lower altitude, so it can still maintain a lot of power even as you get higher up in the atmosphere. So it's a pretty powerful plane for something of this size. Okay, I think at this point I'm starting up the engine, and for this plane, you know, it's a relatively simple plane. All you need to do is fire up turn on your batteries, prime your engine, set your parking brake, turn the ignition, get the engine going, turn on your lights. It's very, very simple. The virtual cockpit is absolutely beautiful. Everything is clickable. You can interact with everything. You can also configure how you interact with it. You can also configure the layout of your GPS and your radios. And given the it has a, not sure what you call it, but the visibility of this thing, it's kind of like the F-16. You have excellent, the bubble canopy has excellent visibility, and you can you can see quite a bit once you're up there on this thing. Now, in this particular flight, I'm going to run into some issues here, and I'll explain to you what happens when it happens. Right now I'm just setting up the radios. I was going to go ahead and turn on the autopilot so I can check out some other things while I'm cruising. And you know, since I've had a Beech Duke or a RealAir aircraft, I have a pretty good idea as to how things work. A lot of times I imagine these developers, they reuse code from one plane to another. So once you get used to one particular model that the developer releases, you have a good idea how the rest of them behave. So the first thing that I've learned is once you do a pushback in this thing, look what happens. Once you stop your pushback, it pops a wheelie and you wind up on your bum. I'm pretty sure that was by design, or maybe it was a bug, who knows. Anyhow, you can quickly get yourself out of this situation by giving it a little bit of power, and that pops you right back into proper configuration. And then you continue with your taxi. And look what happens here. I'm trying to turn, give it left rudder, it's barely turning, and there's a reason for that. The way it is right now, the nose wheel is not connected to the rudder, and I was using a Cytec stick, so I could not do differential braking, where you turn the aircraft by breaking one wheel and letting the aircraft pivot. So what you got to do is come into the settings on this tab and make sure that you have your rudder and your nose wheel coupled together. That way, if you're using a Cytec stick for flying, you can steer the plane on the ground. Otherwise, you'd need a separate pair of rudder pedals.
Foxtrot, Sierra Golf, you are not cleared to take off.
Okay, so I went ahead and took off from the airport. By the way, I'm in Ohio. I think I was taking off from Bolton Field. I was going to go ahead and fly west VFR to Dayton. That was my test flight. And as you can see here, it's a small plane and had active sky next loaded. And the weather was just tossing this thing around. I mean, I was bouncing back and forth. Had a hard time controlling the plane with the weather setting the way it was, and didn't seem that windy outside, but evidently once you got up there between 2,500 4,000 feet, the plane was being tossed around pretty bad, and I ran into an issue. You're about to see what happened. Now the settings that I have on the simulator is I try to keep everything as real as possible. So it has detect crash and stress can cause damage to the airplane. And because of that, this tiny little thing was being thrown around and everything. And what happened was I crashed mid-air because the plane fell apart. What you have to do is you need to go into your simulation settings and set it exactly the way the instructions are, which is to disable or ignore crash and damage, and make sure that the realism settings is exactly as it is here. And this allows the realism programming in the aircraft to override what's in the simulator so you can get the most out of the airplane. Now I had the flight saved, so it puts me back where I started. So I went ahead and taxied back to the runway. This time I called the tower and get permission to take off. And now what's going to happen is I'll still get thrown around with the weather, but the plane won't come apart as per how flight simulation is set up. So that's how I learned that for this aircraft and all other aircraft that RealAir simulation produces, you need to make sure that you set up the simulator exactly as they tell you. Now, one thing I like about this plane, very, very powerful engine, so you can fly high, you can fly fast. The installer itself, they make a version for FSX. It'll also detect, or you can tell it if you have FSX or FSX Steam Edition. It's also compatible with P3D. I think it's version 3.0, I don't recall. Point is, they have an installer for all the most popular simulators. They don't have one for FS 2004. Everything that you see in the cockpit, like I said before, it's clickable. Also, you can configure how you interact with it, whether you left click, right click, use a mouse wheel and whatnot. The sounds, you can configure how loud how quiet you want various sounds, such as the stall warning, the thump of the landing gear when you retract it. By the way, it does have retractable landing gear. The noise it makes when you retract or extend the flaps, drag from the flaps, drag from the spoilers, the volume of the when you interact with the cockpit. There's just so many things you can configure, and you can make it exactly how you like it. Same with other RealAir products. It uses standard FSX GPS for GPS. There is a separate configurator, as I mentioned before, that you can fire up and set everything the way you want it. You can also customize your views with keyboard shortcuts. It has an angle of attack indicator, that little thing bobbing up and down to the left. And it's a pretty fun aircraft to fly. Having said that, it is, or it uses a flight stick and not a yoke, and to be totally honest, I enjoy flying with a yoke. So with this one, I'm flying with it on my Alienware notebook. That's the platform that I have for when I want to fly fighter jets or any aircraft that uses a stick and not a yoke. So that works out pretty good. Okay, so let me talk about the issues that I've had with this plane. The number one issue that I have is once you fire up FSX and you go to select the plane, and you select one of these Lancair legacy planes, when you go back to the interface, that window that shows you a preview of the plane, when it's spinning around, in this case, for this application or this particular aircraft, that window comes back black. You don't see anything. And I'm not sure what the deal is with that. The plane will go ahead and load, but for some reason the preview window doesn't come up. And as I said, the plane tips over when you're stopping your pushback, and the nose wheel needs to be coupled to the rudder if you're going to be using the static yoke as your rudder input, as opposed to separate rudder pedals. That aside, the plane flies very nicely. Like I said, it's very powerful for a plane of this size, so it takes a little bit of getting used to. Has what do you call those? Fixed wing, rear wing, the propeller. You can set the angle of the props, mixture, just like any other general aviation aircraft. And as far as climb rate, once you open this thing up, you can get a good 2,000, 2,400 feet per minute climb. Alright, so let's talk about the documentation. One thing I've noticed with various add-on aircraft, the level of documentation that comes with it, sometimes it's just enough for you to get you in the air, sometimes it's quite extensive. The documentation that comes with this add-on is excellent. In fact, I want to say it's outstanding. It tells you everything you need to know. Answers all your questions. It's pretty straightforward. The illustrations are outstanding. One thing I like about this particular documentation is better than most other aircraft that I've seen is, and it's just a reflection of how old I am. The font is larger, so I can actually read it and not have to kill myself trying to read it. The flying guide has a good table of contents, and it's a good 127 pages. It also comes with a FAQ document, frequently asked questions. Comes with a checklist and a little manual to go along with the autopilot. The autopilot in this, I think it's the same autopilot in the Beech Duke, so you know, learning to use it wasn't much of a challenge for me since I've flown the Beech Duke so many times. Alright, so let me talk about the specifications for this aircraft. I should have gone into that earlier. It defaults to the 310 horsepower engine. If you want, you can, once you run the configurator, you can specify the 410 horsepower engine. Propellers are 3-blade, constant speed, length 22 feet, wingspan 25.5 feet, aspect ratio 7.95 to 1, max G loading, which is a max of 4.4 Gs and negative 2.2, empty weight 1,400 pounds, gross weight 2,200 pounds, fuel capacity 66 gallons, useful fuel load 800 pounds, max cruise is 240 knots true airspeed at 8,000 feet. I think for the 410 horsepower engine you can get it up to 300 knots true airspeed. Stall speed clean is 75 knots. Stall speed with the flaps extended 65 knots. Service ceiling 18,000 feet. Takeoff distance 850 feet. Wow, that is short. Landing roll 900 feet. Crosswind landing 18 knots component. Fuel consumption 13.5 to 15 gallons per hour, typical. Maximum range 1,100 statute miles, that's pretty good. And as I talked about before, the rate of climb 2,200 feet per minute, max gross weight. And speeds never exceed 276 knots, best rate of climb 135 knots. Full flap extension speed. Oh yeah, let me talk about that. You can set the flaps so that if you deploy them and you're going too fast, it will break up the flaps, or the flaps will fail and be destroyed. Landing gear speed 132 knots. It also has the settings for takeoff, cruise, and approach, and it has a nice little checklist here, all the various phases of flight. Oh, and this is the first for me. This plane, since it can fly that high and it's a piston aircraft, will actually simulate hypoxia. That's pretty cool. Hypoxia is what happens when you get above 10,000 feet. If you don't have oxygen, or if you're not flying in a pressurized cabin, or pressurized cockpit, you start losing your everything starts becoming flaky. Your decision making goes out the door. Everything starts getting dizzy, and before you know it, you're unconscious, then you crash and you die. So with this plane, it has a switch for oxygen, and you need to make sure that's turned on when you're above 10,000 feet. You can also configure how fit or how healthy you are, and it will also simulate, if you want, the effects of hypoxia, and it actually has in the configuration how long it takes for hypoxia to set in. So I imagine, I didn't try it with this flight, but I imagine if you don't have oxygen on and you get past 10 or 12,000 feet, I guess everything starts looking fuzzy. I guess I should try that. I've never had a plane that simulates hypoxia before. Not sure what the point is, but I guess they want to keep it as real as possible. With that, most of my flights with piston aircraft, I never take them past 8,000 feet because I never go that far, and I know, since I try to keep my flights as real as possible, the cabins aren't pressurized, and if you go above 10,000 feet, the effects of hypoxia can set in. Alright, so I think at this point I'm on final approach to runway 36 at Dayton Cox International Airport. Coming down pretty fast, as you can see. My approach, I'm a little bit steep, so there goes the speed brakes. Oh yeah, I'm totally diving towards that runway. And it did a pretty good job of slowing me down. That aside, you know, as far as general aviation aircraft goes, it's just relatively easy to fly. Oh, and the price. This aircraft was 34 euros on the Sim Market website. I don't know how much that is in dollars, but that's less than 40 bucks. That's kind of expensive for a general aviation aircraft, but like I said, this is top notch. This is as good as you're gonna get for a general aviation piston aircraft. So I think it's worth the money. Just gotta remember, you need to set your simulation settings exactly as the instructions say, and if it conflicts with your other planes, go ahead and save a file so that you can bring that up every time you choose to fly this particular aircraft.
Foxtrot Sierra Golf, exit runway when able. Foxtrot Sierra Golf, contact ground on 121.9er. 121.9er, Foxtrot Sierra Golf.
Alright, now let's take a look at the documentation, or should I say the configuration application that gets installed when you buy this aircraft. You run this outside of FSX, you just go ahead and fire up the executable. Here you can access the PDFs directly from the configurator. That's very helpful. Most other add-ons, when you buy them, the PDFs, the manuals for the plane, comes buried deep in the folder and the file system, and you have to hunt for them. In this case, you go ahead and launch the configurator tool, and bam, the documentation is right there. I wish other add-on manufacturers would pay attention to that level of detail. Here are your checklists, very straightforward. And the next thing I believe is the frequently asked questions, FAQs, very, very useful. And you know, when you see this level of documentation and the attention to detail they put in here, that tells me that this is a quality product. And I think this is the instructions for the autopilot. And like I said, fonts and everything is nice and big. You don't have any problems reading it. That level of attention to detail, to me, leaves a very, very good impression. Next, these are the various attributes of your plane that you can configure. You can tell it what size engine you want. You can configure how bright the gauges are, the reflection, the displays. You can configure the realism. This one right here, you need to make sure that that is enabled if you don't have a separate set of rudder pedals. Otherwise, you won't be able to turn effectively. You can configure your cold and dark. You can select the 410 turbocharged engine. Okay, Windows is being a jerk here. You can configure your panel however you want. I mean, all sorts of options. The GPS is pretty much yes or no. So, and here you can make the plane nice and tight, that doesn't shake much, doesn't rattle much, or you can make it nice and loose. With my Beech Duke, I have it in such a way that once you start the engines up, all the dials bobble back and forth. If you've ever flown in a real aircraft, that's how most of the dials are. Nothing is nice and steady like in a car. Everything just rattles back and forth. And this add-on simulates that very well. Again, attention to detail is superb. Sounds, you can configure, various sounds and whatnot. And here you can actually simulate, like I said, you can simulate hypoxia. I try to keep as fit as possible, so I make myself very fit here. And you can also turn on labored breathing if you run into hypoxia and don't have the oxygen on. By default, the oxygen switch is set to load when you fire up the aircraft, but if you want, you can go ahead and turn that off, so that if you forget to turn it on above 10,000 feet, you start to pass out. And I think that's it. Not much of a review, as you can tell. I kind of sort of did this half-assed, but what are you going to do? I also bought a Eurofighter Typhoon. I think I'll do a review for that sometime this week. Anyway, this is Flight Sim Guy. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.